I'm trying to present the ice in a way that isn't, here's a bunch of science. Just take it in. This space was wonderful because it has 3 dimensions. And I like the idea of playing with altitude. My intent is to take you on this journey from the highest glaciated places on Earth down to the ocean, but across the globe.
All right, everybody, welcome. It is my honor to welcome you all to the Jerry Crail Johnson Earth Sciences and Map Library. My name is Leslie Reynolds. I'm the Senior Associate Dean in the libraries, and we are very pleased to host this Direct Encounters with Arctic Landscapes panel discussion. We have an impressive group of representatives to discuss their real and lived experiences of climate change in the Arctic, individuals from our own Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research, which we lovingly call INSTAR, and the Geological Sciences and Environmental Studies departments. They are joined by representatives from the Glaciology Center of the Colorado School of Mines and the Arctic Arts Project. We are very grateful for the generous support we've received from the Nest Studio of the Arts in hosting this event and in staging this immersive exhibit by Environmental Studies PhD graduate Chris Dunn. Many thanks to Chris for his work in convening this panel and in persisting in his vision for our space. We also thank Joanne Guillory, Program Manager of Nest, whose organizational skills and campus connections have been crucial to the success of this collaborative effort. We also want to acknowledge our appreciation of our own map curator and metadata project manager, Naomi Heiser. She has managed, coordinated, and worked out every detail of this exhibit and the panel discussion from their inception, and we could not have done this without her. Thank you, Naomi. I now want to turn this over to our moderator for this event, Kelsey Simpkins, who will introduce our panelists. I should introduce Kelsey, though. She is an award-winning science writer and media relations specialist at the University of Colorado Boulder. She completed her master's degree in environmental journalism here at CU in 2018, during which she completed her thesis reporting project on the intersection of the arts of the Arctic and climate change. We're really looking forward to this panel, so I'm now going to turn this over to you, Kelsey.
Welcome, everyone. I'm now going to introduce our wonderful panelists here today. Starting with, on the far end, we have Chris Dunn, the convener of this panel. He is a writer, explorer, and photographer with a PhD in environmental studies from CU. His work is heavily interdisciplinary, but is most akin to environmental philosophy. His passion is world exploration, especially its wild and inaccessible crevices. He uses writing and photography paired with academic research to tell stories that convey the immense environmental challenges we are presently facing. Chris has lived and worked in Alaska, Montana, Washington, Colorado, and abroad. Next, we have Tasha Snow. She is a postdoctoral researcher in the Mines Glaciology Laboratory within the Colorado School of Mines Department of Geophysics. She is a research scientist working to better understand high-latitude ocean and glacier changes and how they will impact the planet. Her current work focuses on how oceans interact with glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica, and she is developing new ways to apply satellite thermal infrared imagery to study these systems. She also gets to adventure in polar regions and has spent multiple seasons on icebreakers out to sea and on the ice, both in Greenland and Antarctica. We have Astrid Ogilvie, who is a research professor at INSTAR here at CU Boulder. She is also a senior scientist at the Stephenson Arctic Institute in Northern Iceland. Previously, she was Nansen Professor of Arctic Studies in 2014. Her research focuses on the broader issues of climatic change and contemporary Arctic issues, as well as the environmental humanities. She's the author of some 100 scientific papers and 2 edited books. Then we have Carey Kepping. He is an internationally acclaimed environmental photographer, visionary, and communicator dedicated to the stewardship of the environment and the Arctic. He is founder and executive director of the nonprofit Arctic Arts Project, whose mission is to share with the world a visual understanding of climate change and the solutions and adaptations we need to survive. His work has been published in Smithsonian, National Geographic, World Wildlife Foundation, BBC, and many more prestigious channels around the world. Carey is also a research affiliate at InStar here at CU Boulder. And finally, we have Brad Markle, who is an assistant professor here at InStar and the Department of Geological Sciences. He is a scientist interested in the Earth's climate system, how it works, how it changes through time. Markle studies paleoclimate and climate dynamics, particularly in the high latitudes. He's worked both in the Antarctic and the Arctic and uses geochemical proxy records from ice cores and models to understand what the Earth's climate looked like in the past and the mechanisms by which it works. So first we're going to start with them giving a little bit more explanation of the work they're currently up to, further intros about themselves, with a couple minutes each of short presentation, and we'll start with Brad.
Sure. Thanks very much, and yeah, thanks everyone for coming here today. So I'm a climate scientist. I am really interested in how the Earth's climate has changed over long periods of time, and also in particular interested in like the mechanisms by which climate changes, how it works, how different parts of the climate system interact with each other. I work especially in the high latitude, so a lot in the Arctic, but also the Antarctic. And a large part of my research is drilling into glaciers and ice sheets, extracting ice that fell as snow there hundreds of thousands of years ago, measuring geochemistry in that snow to understand what the climate looked like in the past. Through this, we can reconstruct these long histories of how the Earth's climate has changed, and then understand the physical processes that cause it to change and how different parts of the climate system work. I've worked a lot in the Arctic, mostly in Alaska and large mountain ranges in Canada as well. Again, going up to glaciers to collect ice samples. And then I've also worked in the Antarctic, so not the Arctic, but the one on the other side of the world.
Great.
That's it.
And let's learn a little bit more about Carrie.
Hi, thanks everybody for coming. I am Executive Director of the Arctic Arts Project, and the premise that we began with 12 years ago was to bring visual understanding of the science of climate. And so many times what happens with the science papers that we were reading a dozen years ago was that we had no idea how to present that to a general population, to where they could grasp methane bubbles. You know, how do you talk about something invisible? How do you visually capture something that is not understood outside of a science document? So we took that and have worked diligently to try and put the visuals, as we call it, visual literacy, to the science of climate change. So we have extended our work in Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Svalbard, Russia, Canada, US, all of the Arctic regions to try and capture different science aspects in different ecosystems and what's happening within those systems. Everything from permafrost and the changes that we're seeing dramatic access to in Greenland and Canada, ice loss globally, so it's not just high alpine, but it's high latitude, high elevation. And so we're really trying to get a broad scope of details on how they're relevant to the rest of the world. So we just returned from our work in Svalbard, where we were taking a study that took the 7-time warming rate of Svalbard to the rest of the Earth and trying to put some kind of understanding of how that's a canary in the coal mine to the rest of Earth. So that's our next film, and putting the pieces together. So.
Great. Moving on to Astrid.
Hello, everyone. So yes, I'm Astrid Ogilvie, and I'm very interdisciplinary. I think I'm interested in just about everything. But I've had I've had quite an interesting career path, I think, and I like to tell this to students particularly because I think, you know, when you're thinking about what you want to do in the future and so on, do what you want to do what is your passion. And so I started out studying history, particularly Scandinavian history, and then I became interested in kind of looking at, you know, what is happening around the players? What is the stage? So an interest in then environmental history, which became an interest in climate history. And because I was a historian, it was very natural for me, and I was very lucky to get help along the way and to be employed to do these things, but to look at historical records of how climate had changed in the past. And that's always been a big focus of mine and still is. But I've kind of got dragged into the present and sort of the future, and in that a lot of my current interests and projects focus on what's happening in the Arctic. And I've looked particularly at coastal communities and all the things that are going on in small communities in Norway, Iceland, Greenland, and so on, and thinking about climate issues and environmental issues, but also social issues, because it's these things that are happening, it's not one thing that's having an effect. It's a combination of different things. My current projects focus on tourism in the Arctic, particularly these ships, tourist ships that are coming into the little communities, which can cause problems. I've got a project on environmental change in Svalbard, and then I've got a more historical project as well, looking at sea ice changes in the past.
As was mentioned, I've mostly been doing remote sensing using satellite imagery to study how oceans deliver heat to glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica. And as you can imagine, this imagery is vivid, so it's super useful for communicating about science, and it's beautiful to look at. There are a few that are in this exhibit that Christopher put together. And so I get to look at how all of this looks from the sky quite often. And I'm really interested in using thermal, looking at the heat signatures in comparison to what is being measured by ocean instruments, so that we can figure out new ways to use satellite imagery to look back into the past. Because we've had satellites that have been going since 1974, when Landsat was first put up by NASA. And that was our first look at the ice sheets around the world. And so what I'm doing now is trying to figure out new ways that we can use that information back in time to understand what's going on right now. And we can see quite a lot of change. My background is very similarly circuitous, I guess, to Astrid's. I started out in oceanography looking at biology. So I studied phytoplankton and their genetics. And then I got really excited about climate change at the end of my undergrad and went into the military. So I was an officer in the United States Navy for 4 years. And then I came back to do my degree because I was just in love with science and climate change, and ended up doing something very similar to what Brad does, but with ocean sediment. So I use ocean sediment cores to look at past climate change. And going down to Antarctica for my first time, just fell in love with all of that. And I started doing computer programming during my master's, and kind of switched gears a little bit into remote sensing, which is now more computer programming and data analysis. And now the current projects that I have some are associated with machine learning. We also just started a project that's really exciting for me, where we're creating a cloud computing environment, a place where scientists from NASA who work in polar regions can all come together, learn how to collaborate and do computer programming and accelerate how they discover data, how they make new discoveries within the data, and share code and things like that. So a lot of open science, a lot of push for inclusivity and diversity. And so that's kind of me in a nutshell. A lot of varied work that I've done, but putting it all together somehow.
Yes, and I'm Chris Dunn. You got the basic details, but I'll just add that I finished a PhD here at CU in environmental studies last December, and my background is primarily in philosophy. So that's a long story in terms of how I got from philosophy to more like Arctic science interests and things like that I won't elaborate in too much detail, except to say that my real concern that drives my kind of theoretical inquiries is human nature relationships. And my specific concern that I focus a lot of my dissertation work on is how does our relationship to the natural world get mediated, especially through things like technological mediation. So like, for instance, something like remote sensing, where you're not actually in the landscape as you might be through some other form of life, for instance, if you're a local community member in some of these places. And so, and I'm interested to know, like, does that mediation affect how we manage and treat nature in some larger way? And so that's kind of some of my like theoretical concerns. But I also have just spent a lot of time in the Arctic. I used to work for parks. That was we'll get to this, but my sort of my entryway there. And it's a story, and maybe we'll get to it. But the last thing I'll say is I'm teaching a course on energy and society at the Colorado School of Mines, and I'm still very much on the ladder, following my passions at each step, and I'm hoping Astrid's right, that it gets me to somewhere. so that's where I'm at, and that's it.
So what we're going to do now is we're going to get the panelists to engage in some discussion based on some questions we've prepared all about the Arctic and elements of their work. So this is where it should get fun for everybody. And then once we're done with that, we'll have a little bit of Q&A, save some time for that at the end. So if you do have any questions at the end, we'll bring this microphone back out and you'll come up here and ask, just so you're aware of how that will work. So the first question, which I love, which perhaps Chris has a story on that he was hinting at, and again, everyone is welcome to answer as they're moved to do so. What initially drew you to the Arctic?
You gonna jump in?
Sure, yeah. Didn't know we were going in order. Yeah,
You don't have to, but.
it's a good question. So I grew up like climbing and like to go hiking and exploring mountains and this sort of thing. So I was always drawn to sort of wild places and icy glacier places in particular. And that was always just sort of a hobby interest to me. But I became interested, I guess, in a much more deeper way when I started doing climate science and finding like this intersection of both wild places that I like to be, that you can find in high mountains and in the Arctic and in the Antarctic, with like deep intellectual interest in understanding how the world works.
Carrie, you were giving a real sly smile to Brad, so I think
I loved it.
you have something. I think you need to add something next.
And I think all of us have this adventurer part of us, you know, that you see the mystery in the Arctic. And the first time that I saw it, I was actually climbing Denali and came across, and if anybody knows, Denali is clear about 20% of the time, so you can't really see Denali most of the time. But I was on this ridge, and Denali happened to be clear, and I was with a guide, and all of a sudden came across this beautiful ridge of mounds, like meter in diameter mounds going across this ridge, and I was photographing that because it was mysterious. I had never seen it before. I've been out in the world hiking and climbing. What was it? Well, it took almost a year to actually find what it was. It was polygon hummocks or permafrost melt up on this ridge in Denali. Shouldn't have been there. It was at 12,000 elevation. Shouldn't have been there. So that became this quest of, I can put visuals, our team can put visuals to the science. And I met a permafrost scientist out of Fairbanks, Vladimir, and he was amazing, told us what it was, we documented, and then it became this quest of really putting the visuals to the science. And so it's been an obsession, you know, because once you connect, I think, to the Arctic or anything with that kind of power, you're hooked.
Right, and you both, sounds like, had firsthand experiences as part of that. Anyone else have a similar experience?
Well, no, I think I'm a little bit different in a way because, well, I've come to the Arctic from many different directions, but I think originally, in a way, it was through literature and history. You know, I was studying Scandinavian history for my first degree. I spent some time in Norway around that, and then I started reading the sagas of Icelanders. And that made me really want to go to Iceland. And then I ended up doing that and focusing. So much of my work has focused on Iceland and the historical records. And I think also through art in a way. And then I worked for many years in England. And then I came to Boulder and started working at INSTAR, which of course is the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research. So I was thinking, oh, Arctic. And no, it wasn't quite that simple. But before, while I was in Britain at my institute there, it was mainly this focus on the historical climatology. And then when I came here, it was, I started working with a lot of different colleagues, anthropologists, archaeologists, and my geologist friends at INSTAR. And then I was sort of drawn further and further north and further into the Arctic. So.
Mine was definitely a mix. I definitely got hooked on the Arctic basically through studies. So I was doing oceanography in the equatorial regions in Ecuador and also Washington State. And when I started to learn about climate change and how important thermohaline circulation is, it's basically surface ocean water comes up from Florida in the Gulf Stream towards the Arctic, and when it gets up there, it's very salty. It gets cold, and because it's so salty, it starts to sink. And that starts a circulation around the globe, deep in the ocean and at the surface, a general circulation that takes thousands of years. And when that's happening in the North Atlantic around Greenland, that changes the climate in comparison to when it's not happening. And just the profoundness of that special area got me very excited about the Arctic, about Greenland. Similar processes happen in the Antarctic. And so these are places that really affect oceanography around the world. And that's why I started studying it, because they affect climate change. But then when I went to Antarctica for the first time, it was just like, it's breathtaking. Nothing you've ever seen. Like icebergs that are the size of buildings or a football field, or even larger. Some of them are the size of, like a city, a small city. You cannot see from one end to the other. It's flat, it's white, but it's so incredibly beautiful and remote. There's no one out there. So it feels really special to be out there, to be in a place that's literally untouched, that people have never been to before. And I think that there's just something extremely special about having that experience, being able to contribute to the fundamental science in a location that is just, I'll never stop trying to go back.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly that I'm sort of like in between. I was sort of outdoorsy in my lower 48 life, and also had an interest through literature. So like Jack London, Dick Pernicke, and especially most notably Barry Lopez' Arctic Dreams kept drawing me further and further north. And I first got to Alaska in 2006 doing seasonal work, which turned into park work, but it's turned more into like what I really care about, which is more creative aspirations, which is how I got to this exhibit point. But it was kind of this little tug rope, like there's more up there, I just got to keep going. But the initial was really like the open possibilities and this idea of this like boundless landscape that I felt like I was getting through literature, and it was interesting to see what was really there compared to my sort of imaginations over time. But
Yeah, I think a lot of us would have heard the term the Arctic bug, or some variation of that, which we have all caught. And once you go, you really want to go back. The next question I have is referring to some of your individual work, and what are some of the greatest challenges to working in the Arctic? Because you all have slightly different variations, such as bringing camera equipment versus scientific equipment versus whatever type of data you're trying to capture. So feel free to start out of order. I'm just curious if anything has come to mind in terms of the greatest challenges you faced in the Arctic.
Well, I'll go quickly because my challenges perhaps are a little bit different to the other people here, in that I've lived in Arctic places and I've traveled in the Arctic, but a lot of my work takes place in archives and libraries. So my challenges tend to be how to read very difficult Gothic handwriting that's in Danish or Icelandic, and which I can do, but it's not always easy.
It's a unique one.
Bugs. In the areas of the Arctic that I work, which is not all parts of the Arctic, but I've encountered, as there's a reputation, and I have had moments that live up to that reputation. Mosquitoes, black flies, but it's not all the time, but it's just enough. That's one thing. I can say more, but
Getting to where we're going with a purpose, I mean, that is really hard. So it may, it's not let's catch a flight someplace and we're there. It's catch a flight and then something else and then something else and 40 miles of hiking, and then we get to where we're going. And because some of the ecosystems are so small and tight, to get to permafrost collapse in northern Alaska, it takes a bit to figure out where it is first and then get to it. Greenland, there was a shot of our sea ice melt, or not our sea ice melt, but the glacial ice cap melt. And in that, we're trying to document these freshwater lakes that, this was May. It shouldn't have been there. So we're taking small aircraft to get there in some way to get these imagery, but then it disappears. So, Chris and I were talking earlier that the understanding that these just have underwater systems that take all this water off the surface, and where does it go? And then all of a sudden you see it coming out, and to your point, it changes the salinity and the water temperature around Greenland. So it's all interconnected, but to get to these places, to start finding ground zero is tough. So.
Yeah, I would echo some, the challenges for me have mostly been logistical ones, getting there, living there, doing the work there. So in the Arctic, I've worked on projects where we go to the top of high mountains up on Denali or Mount Hunter or Mount Logan and try to drill into the glaciers there, and takes a couple of weeks to hike and ski and climb up to some of those spots. So it's just physically a lot of effort. And then working on the ice sheets, whether Greenland or Antarctica, the logistics of getting to the center of the ice sheet are really tough. It takes, I've spent a week on a sailboat to get to Antarctica before, or you fly on military planes to get to the coast, and then you got to get inland, and weather's never good anywhere. And then some of these projects, again, a lot of my research involves drilling into the ice sheet and getting ice that fell as snow on the ice sheet hundreds of thousands of years ago that is now buried thousands of meters into the ice sheet. Those projects can take dozens and dozens of people working for years and years of drilling every day throughout the summers to get down to the bottom of the ice sheet. So a lot of these projects require collaborations not only between many people at an institution, but many institutions in a country, and in fact many countries, dozens of countries, just to pull off one project. So logistically, it requires lots of effort logistically, but also lots of coordination and collaboration with people.
Yeah, I'd follow up with that on how harsh and remote these environments are. It's every plan that you have to have 3 or 4 backups to it, because the weather's going to be bad and it's going to, make it impossible to get somewhere, or because it's so cold and harsh, it's going to break your instrument or your core or something like that. Everything breaks. The Antarctic and the Arctic just devour instruments. And so, it's so much money. You have to bring multiple of an instrument if you want to be, making sure that you get the science done. I just went to Canada, to the Canadian Arctic a few months ago, and we took a drone, and we only had one drone. And you can guess what happened to that drone on its 3rd flight. It took a nosedive and had a failure. And we were not able to finish that science because of that. So yeah, beyond just being able to get to a place, it's keeping the instruments and things alive. It's really hard.
Really hard, yeah.
And expensive.
So it sounds like from what you've described, especially Carrie, some of what you're actually trying to get to is changing in real time. And so that's actually changing the conditions you're working with, right? So I'm curious to kind of continue on this idea of, this question of what are some of the most significant changes that you're witnessing in going to these places and gathering this data, taking these photos. So just firsthand, what are some of the most significant changes that you've witnessed in the Arctic?
Lots. I'd say two things stand out. One, we were in Greenland working off a Jason Bach's meta-study for IUCN, and it was trying to capture in real time 40 different studies that had happened. And we were there in May, and we were filming some bogs, peat bogs, within a ridge in Greenland. Came back at the 1st of August, and this peat bog had collapsed. So underneath the peat bog, this wetlands was permafrost that had just gone. And so what we saw was a crater that was probably 3 to 4 meters deep and 100 meters long that had just collapsed. So that was number one. Two, we just got back from Svalbard, and right before we left, we got word from NSIDC and Polar Institute that one of the tongues to a glacier up there had retreated since July 5th to August 25th, 800 meters. It had retreated that much in a little over 6 weeks. When we got there, it was another 2 weeks later, and it retreated another 200 meters. So 1,000 meters in 8 weeks, 10 weeks. And that was really heartbreaking, devastating to our team, because there was so much ice chatter. We were trying to get to the glacial front of the tongue, and we never made it. There was so much ice debris from the calving that it just was insurmountable for us, and it was emotional. So yeah, I mean, it carries a lot of weight for our team because we're seeing things that we shouldn't see.
Yeah, and documenting them for the rest of us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone else want to add?
Yeah, I have one. So I think one thing that's really hard for people in general to understand about climate change is this long term. It's large change, but it's pretty gradual on the timescales that we all experience it. And even if the climate wasn't changing, climate is inherently variable. So some years are warm, some years are cold. Some years are warm, some years are cold. It's always variable. And so it makes it hard to sort of see these long-term changes. One place I work a lot is on this ice field in Alaska. And in fact, I help run a summer school up there. And this summer school has been happening every year since the 1940s, which is a really long time to see these changes. And I've been going up there maybe 10 or 11 years. And we had a bunch of like really warm, hot summers. All the snow on the glaciers was melting. It was getting, when all the snow on the top of the glacier melts, all these crevasses come out. It makes it hard to get around. And there's but again, there's warm years and then cold years. And so some years there's no snow because it all melts, and some years there's lots of snow. But about 5 years ago, it just kept getting worse and worse. And it was the first time I ever personally felt climate change. It was because one summer we went to this place where we have a camp, and we usually stay there 2 weeks, but all the snow melted away too fast, and it was too dangerous to even be there, and we had to leave and go to the next camp. So the next summer we started a week earlier, and the same thing happened. We still had to abandon this camp a week earlier than expected. Despite that, we had started 2 weeks earlier than we had just 2 years before. The program now starts like a month and a half earlier than it did even 10 years ago. So it's really the first time I've experienced these long-term changes rising above the year-to-year variability, mostly in the fact that I was just terrified when I would try to ski out of camp.
Yeah.
I'll just add something briefly. So I first went to Alaska in 2006, but I don't have like a field site that I go to repeatedly. Like I traveled all over Alaska and some other places, Greenland and Iceland, but I did one particular social science study in a native village in the Arctic, in the Brooks Range. And so that was all I was doing, was just asking them like, hey, how are you being impacted by climate change, essentially? So even though I don't have like a specific experience of my own, I got to sort of tap into their experience, which is far longer. And kind of the main issues that they were facing were loss of snow cover, which impedes their ability to travel with snow machines, to hunt particularly. And then similarly, like loss of river ice. So, and then just more unpredictable weather and shifting animal movements and animal presence. So those are some of the things that I could sort of see through them in a way. So that's been my experience.
Yeah.
Say something. Yeah, I think, you know, we're all seeing these changes in the environment, but then there are all these social economic changes as well that are partly due to the changes in the environment and also economic, political issues as well. So many changes, particularly in small communities in, you know, Greenland, Alaska, and I've spent time working in Labrador, talking to people there, and Nunatsiavut. And, you know, people would say to me, if people don't believe in global warming, tell them to come up here and talk to us. And, you know, our livelihood has changed so much. And not just because suddenly there's not the stable sea ice that they would go hunting on, but also political pressure, like, you know, oh, people shouldn't be hunting seals, that's cruel, so okay, we're not allowed to hunt seals, and the fisheries migrations are changing. So all these social issues. And I work a lot with anthropologists who are interested in, you know, fisheries issues, and so, you know, we're seeing migration of fisheries, and that causes difficulties in communities that are dependent on fisheries. And I also work with marine biologists who are looking at whale migrations, and that's really interesting. So, you know, these things that are all interrelated. So in Northern Iceland, where I work half the year, there's a whale research institute, and there's also a very big whale watching industry. And, you know, Icelanders used to focus very much on catching whales. Well, now it's more like watching the whales. And interestingly, into that area, this bay, just north of Akureyri, where I work, a little town called Húsavík, there have been blue whales coming in, and I think, you know, everybody's interested in blue whales because they're such incredible, vast creatures. And for a long time, people were seeing them off the south coast of Iceland, but now they're coming into this bay area every June. And, you know, that's an incredible sight if you can get to see them. However, the waters are warming, to put it simplistically, and people are able to tag these whales, and it seems they're going to Svalbard, you know, because they want to cool off a little bit. So all these different ramifications.
Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to add, Tasha?
Yeah, I might actually take a slightly longer perspective too. We went down to Totten Glacier in East Antarctica, and we that's to the west of Australia, and we were taking sediment cores, and we had this miraculous discovery. We put a sediment core down, and up in the sediment core comes this concrete ball that was basically the size of the core. So if you drop this core perfectly over this, you could have captured it, and otherwise you wouldn't have. And we cracked open this concretion, and in the middle of it was this like woody bud in the middle of it. And this is something, like, Antarctica doesn't have trees. Antarctica doesn't have plants like this. This is something that came from millions, like 60 million years ago. I don't remember what the actual age of it was, but basically bacteria and things created a concrete like formation around it once it was deposited in the sediment, and that protected it. But that goes to tell you, I mean, crocodiles used to be in Antarctica. Used to be a completely different place, and so that was kind of a blast from the past to, you know, kind of see something like that.
That's pretty wild.
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
So this kind of is the great, I think, related question, which is, how do you think your scientific or artistic practice shapes your perceptions of the Arctic? And it sounds like, Tasha, you've had a really long view because of perhaps the science that you've done in Antarctica. And I'm curious, maybe for others to think on and speak a little bit about your scientific or artistic practice shaping your own personal perception of the Arctic or perhaps Antarctic.
I'll go. So this is my concern. So I made the question to hear from others, but here's the inspiration for the question, just to give a little background. So I'm going to go to Barry Lopez again. He wrote an essay called Learning to See, in a collection of essays. And in the book, he's writing about how he has this moment where he's taking photos. I think it's of a polar bear, actually. And eventually he just pulls the camera down and he says, I'm not even seeing this anymore. I'm so focused on this this thing that I'm doing that has some other purpose. I can't even see anymore my subject. And he gave up photography from then on. And so I had read that many years ago, when I barely even been to the Arctic, doing some philosophy work. I was like, that's really interesting. I was really inspired. I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna focus on language and words and writing, just like Barry Lopez. What a cool idea that he was able to come to that and impart that wisdom to me. And traveling all through the Arctic, I would still take lots of pictures. I noticed, even if I had that going in idea. But it wasn't a central thing, but it just kind of grew on me over time that photography became more and more a practice that I did integrate and has so far led to this exhibit. And so now I'm kind of questioning, was he right about that? I'm not sure. That's the question I have here. It really, a camera literally is between you and the thing that you're witnessing. And so I don't know the answer. I'm still learning to see, I guess, but I do always kind of pull the camera down and make sure I'm witnessing the thing directly, at least some of the time, really take it in. The last thing I'll add is I'm not sure if he's right, because I also find that photography is a kind of practice that draws me in at times. I concentrate on things I might not normally. So I'm not sure. I don't know the answer, but that's some of my.
Yeah. And for example, perhaps Astrid might have some thoughts on how your texts engage you.
Well,
yes,
yes, thank you. I could say something about that, but I just want to follow on very, very quickly to this one, and that is that, the Arctic is so many different things, and the countries are so different, and there's always that terrible thing about people confusing Iceland and Greenland, and isn't Iceland icy? Well, it's not very icy at all. It's doesn't have that many trees, but it is pretty green. And I learnt something interesting the other day, and that was that, I think now so many people travel to Iceland that myth is, or that confusion is sort of going. But, and I could say something about why Greenland is green. And anyway, but I'll try and confine myself to one thing at a time. So, I think in times past, Icelanders didn't want to be regarded as the Arctic because people thought, Eskimos, forgive the word, but, that was the word that was used, lived in Iceland. And they wanted to say, no, we don't live in snow houses, and we're Europeans, we're not Arctic. Anyway, that's all rather interesting, I think. But yes, so the Arctic is so many different things. It's different landscapes, it's different places, it's different cultures. But yes, so my text, well, I'm one of the things I do, as I've explained, is I look at historical records, documentary records, to learn about climate in the past. And systematic meteorological observations were only begun perhaps around 1850, some places a little earlier, but typically around that time in Europe, in European countries. So obviously before that time, we have to look at, we have to use proxy data, tree rings, sediment cores, and so on. But we can also use historical records that go back, very roughly 1,000 years or at least 500 years or so. So I look at these records, and I work particularly in Iceland, and part of the reason I do is that there's so much information, there's so much of different written records, and that tells me something about the climate of the past and how it's changed, and of course you have to have the context to have a feeling for what's happening in the present and indeed in the future. So
I want to spin off of both of their comments. One of the things that I find is the Arctic is so overwhelming. It's so majestic. It's got so many pieces to it. And to try and capture any one thing is virtually impossible because it's all connected to one another. So it becomes almost, if I'm allowed to use this, a spiritual journey. And I'll give you an example. I was on a ridge overlooking a vast fjord in Greenland and watching maybe 100 icebergs within this fjord. And a pod of humpback whales was doing spiral feeding below. My purpose was to shoot a full moon rising and aurora coming over these icebergs. So I had full moon, aurora, a pod of whales. It was beautiful. I put the camera down when 2 Arctic fox pups started playing at my feet, realizing that there was no way to capture every single element. And I just sat. To Chris's point, you just take it in because you really somehow get lost in that camera. You get lost in the moment behind a lens, but you can't lose sight of how amazing this place is.
Yeah, and to follow with that, has anyone else had a profound, that sounds like a pretty profound moment.
That's pretty profound.
Yeah, has anyone else had a profound moment, maybe not with Arctic pups, at their feet, but it's hard to beat. Any other profound moments, while in the course of doing your work or in your journeys to or fro in the Arctic?
Yeah, I can think of a couple of ones that felt fairly profound. So one sort of like, the thing is about going to Arctic or the Antarctic, everything feels very profound. It's very sort of otherworldly places to be. I can think of a couple of categories. So one is about sort of the remoteness of some of these places. So I was on a project where we were going around the Antarctic, and we were on an icebreaker, and then we would go from the icebreaker, a big ship, on helicopters to these tiny little islands off the coast of Antarctica that were covered in glaciers with just like 1,000-foot cliffs on all sides. And so we'd fly on the top and we'd get out and drill ice cores. And most of these places, no one could have ever been there before. It's a place where you need like good weather and an icebreaker and a helicopter. You never have all three. And then we got lucky and we were there. And it was a remarkable thing to like tromp around somewhere where no one in human history had tromped. And then likewise, drilling really deep ice cores from the ice sheet, we drill down 2 miles into the ice and we pull up ice that fell as snow 100,000 years ago, and we pull it out, and we're pulling out meters and meters, and doing this all the time, but realizing that you're like touching something that has been trapped down there in the dark and the cold for 100,000 years felt pretty remote too.
Yeah. Or does anyone have, maybe not a profound story, but just a really good adventure story as well?
I want to hear from others, but I do have a profound that
Okay.
will share, not take too long. But I took the Colville River basically from the Brooks Range in Alaska to the Beaufort Sea or the Arctic Ocean. And you pass kind of the last village, a good, 30 miles inland or something like that. I can't remember exactly. And we wanted to keep going to the ocean itself. And the Colville spreads out into this vast delta. And it's just like completely, absolutely flat. And then you hit the Arctic Ocean, which is obviously flat too. And we just came at this precise moment that it was a slack tide. It was completely windless. And it was kind of this mixed sun and cloud. So the entire Arctic Ocean was just this perfect mirror. And the whole delta behind us is kind of this mix of mud and water that was also kind of this mirror of the sky. And so just the light was just like this purity I'd never witnessed in my life. I was with someone else, but just like we were just in awe of this like moment in this place. And not only that, but it's this weird place of illusions and hallucinations where there's all kinds of effects because of, like in the scientific terms, because of the cold temperatures and things, where the light will kind of shift and transform. So we would actually like see distant objects kind of rise above the horizon, and logs would turn into cabins. Like we saw a log, we swore like, oh, that's a good cabin in case a polar bear comes. We can escape into that. And as we were paddling down, it's a log. It's very obviously a log. And then we saw some like creature in the distance that was just kind of shifting dimensions and shapes and running towards us, we thought, and it gets to us and it's a caribou that seems to be just as terrified as us of like what's going on here. So that for me was one of the more profound moments I've ever had, and happened to be in the Arctic. So
Yeah. I want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A before we hit 5 o'clock in case, anyone in our audience has to run. But are there any last thoughts on, fun adventure stories, profound moments, anything we touched on that you'd like to return to as well?
Well, maybe I could say something very, very quickly about Greenland. Because, people say, oh, Greenland, why do they call it Greenland? And we know about the naming of Greenland from 2 different Icelandic sagas. But I often think, and the idea was that Eric the Red came back and said, oh, it's so green, and it's like a real estate agent's ploy, come guys, come and join us, it's all green. But it is green. If you sail up in your Viking ship, it is green. The coasts are all green. These guys were not flying over and seeing the ice. So it makes perfect sense. So I'd just like to exonerate these early people.
I think something about the profoundness of the Arctic that I noticed was going through a storm there, when winds get to be, 50 miles an hour and you're out in tents and there's just 6 of you, for hundreds of miles. It can be really intense to go through a storm. And what's incredible about these storms being on the ice is there are these things called sastrugi. They're like bumps on the ice. Snow is just basically like drifts of snow that are moving around, that are quite solid and are not quite solid. They're bumps that you can you're on a ski-doo or you're snowmobiling, you can jump over them, things like that. But in the middle of these storms, the landscape changes entirely. These things move around. So when you come out the next day, the entire landscape has changed. And then when you go outside, when the storm is happening, it's one of the most beautiful things that you can see when you're there. Like when I don't know if anyone has been through a dust storm before, but dust storm, you can't see very far. Then, a lot of times there's clouds above you. Snowstorms very similar. It gets white out oftentimes, but when the clouds start to clear out, then you have clear sky above you and the snow is still blowing because you still have high winds. And then you can start to get sundogs. And we saw like a double one, so like 2 halos around the sun because of the ice in the air is refracting sunlight. And it's just one of the most beautiful things that you can see. There's, snow blowing around. It's like diamond dust in the air. Like it's changing the landscape profoundly overnight. I think seeing that change is incredible, especially since you can't see it from satellite. Like you get no idea that sort of process can happen from satellite for the most part.
Yeah, that's really like a first-hand experience you really can't get anywhere else. Yeah, before we move into Q&A, in case anyone needs to leave, I just wanted to say we should thank our panelists with a short round of applause, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing all these really interesting, exciting insights. And if anyone has any questions, I'm going to move this mic back to be an option for y'all.
So last week I was looking at the NSF website, and 4 or 5 years ago, they posed 10 big ideas, and navigating the new Arctic was one of them. And when I read that, I was like, why the Arctic? So maybe now I have a bit of better perspective. But I just wonder, and perhaps this is a bit of a controversial question, if the world is big, and if we talk about climate and earth sciences, why the Arctic? Why not the atmosphere? Why not the Amazon? Why not the oceans? Did the NSF get it right? And should that be something that we really focus our studies on?
It's because so much of what's happening in the Arctic influences what's happening in the lower latitudes, and I'm sure my climate colleagues can answer this more accurately than me, but the Arctic is so important, and and we're seeing things happening in the Arctic that will happen soon in the lower latitudes. So yeah, NSF absolutely did get it right.
I would say the fact that the changes occurring around the globe are amplified in the Arctic also makes it really important. I mean, the change in sea ice that's happening is one of the biggest contributors to our Earth absorbing heat. You also have these navigation, pathways opening up. So it's, national security is something that we care about. I mean, a run of every single importance you can think about. The Arctic is it's experiencing the most change, and so I think that's one of the biggest.
Yeah, the profoundness of places in the Arctic through Arctic amplification that are warming 3 to 4 times faster than the rest of the planet is significant. But to see Svalbard that's warming 7 times faster than the rest of the planet, you're getting amplified situations on a global basis, whether it's warming temperatures of the ocean, jet stream changes, loss of ice, so salinity and water temperatures are changing. That's affecting the rest of the planet, and it's affecting ecosystems. One of the things that we've seen is where pollinators are late to the game because of early season warming. You have flowers, you have grasslands that are going to seed, and yet there's no pollinators there to promote that pollination. Well, if that happens globally, whether it's in the Amazon or elsewhere, we've got serious problems because there's nothing happening within plant species on a global basis. So even accentuated dramatic weather events, not climate, but weather events that are spurred by changes in ocean temperatures and jet stream happen around the world because of what's going on in the Arctic. So,
Yeah.
Great question. They got it right.
Yeah.
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 Canary, and that's our next film is Canary.
Ah.
So there's a lot that's, I don't know if you've heard the word tipping point, the phrase tipping point. It's real, and we've seen a variety of those where there's probably no recovery from certain things happening, whether it's high alpine or high latitude Arctic. So, yeah.
The phrase that as a science writer, I love reading because I think it's just so punchy and so poignant is what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. I feel like that's been in a lot of pieces I've read. A lot of scientists have given quotes, and I think it's a really accurate depiction of that as well.
Yeah.
So that was a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, that was.
Open it up for 1 or 2 more before we conclude, if anyone else has any questions.
I was just wondering a little bit about the creative process of getting the Sensing Eyes exposition, and like what are what is the goal of that exposition, and if you are getting any feedback from it, and also what was the creative process of it.
Yeah. So I guess I have to answer that one. I can't let them answer. But thank you for the question. So I kind of hinted at what I was exploring. The foundation of my exploration is human nature relations. And I'm exploring a facet of that, which is how do our senses inform our relationship with nature? And so I'm kind of exploring what I think of as a dichotomy between sort of like scientific knowing versus more like an embodied knowing, like being in a, like deeply embedded in a place, which you would get more like the kind of the archetypal example is like indigenous people with indigenous knowledge. They're not going around measuring things. They're in the landscape in a practical way, living there. And so they relate to it in a different way than perhaps a scientist might. But even as a non-indigenous person, like visiting, like when I first went to these places in Alaska, I was like adventuring. I wasn't going out to measure, studying anything. And so I later kind of was meeting scientists and interacting with them and like noticing that they always have they have like a project. Like they're going to a specific place for a specific purpose. And so I just like, that's interesting. Like it seems like there might be something going on here. And because at the policy level, it's really what's going on in the science realm that's informing policy really more directly. It seems like that's important for like large scale earth management and the management of specific places and the decisions we're making. And like, is there anything being left out? And so I'm just kind of exploring that. I did a lot in my PhD, like intellectually, and this exhibit is just exploring that in a different way through like a multimedia medium. And so, excuse me, I'm trying to like present the ice in a way that isn't like, here's a bunch of science. It's like, just like take it in. Like here's the direct, like it's obviously indirect, so there's just like this meta level. Like here's this photo that you're not actually sensing, but but you get what I'm saying. But the last thing I'll say is that this space was wonderful because it has 3 dimensions. And I like the idea of playing with altitude. And so I kind of take you on this, my intent is to take you on this journey from the highest glaciated places on Earth down to the ocean, but kind of across the globe. And so just playing with the space and trying to make it an actual physical journey that's exploring partly like this idea of physical knowing. That's kind of some of what's going on. I probably didn't answer everything, but that's some idea of it.
Wonderful. Well, unless anyone else has a burning question to ask, we're just over 5 p.m. here, so I want to take another moment to thank our panelists today for coming and sharing all of their wonderful insights.
Thank you.